The French Revolution. You know the words: liberty, equality, fraternity. It was this incredible moment where the people decided to take charge of their own destiny. But somehow, that dream of freedom spiraled into paranoia, chaos, and the infamous Reign of Terror. And it didn't even end with a republic. It ended with an emperor. So how on earth did it all go so spectacularly wrong?
And that's the big question, isn't it? It's the paradox that we're still wrestling with today. How could a movement that started with such noble, beautiful ideals end up literally devouring its own children? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this explainer.
All right, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the crisis that set the stage for all this. Then we'll see how the people rose up and how that led to the birth of the political terms left and right. Yeah, that started here. After that, we dive into the Reign of Terror, see how a king was replaced by an emperor, and finally, we'll compare the whole thing to another major revolution to see what we can learn.
Okay, let's get into it. Section 1. France's pre-revolutionary crisis. You got to understand, before the first protest, before the first stone was thrown, France was basically a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
You really had a perfect storm of problems brewing. First off, the government was completely broke. Why? Well, ironically, partly because they'd spent a fortune helping the American Revolution. On top of that, bad harvests meant there were massive food shortages. People were literally starving in the streets. And to cap it all off, the entire social structure was just fundamentally unfair.
And this chart, wow, this just shows you how broken that system was. Look at this. You have the first and second estates, that's the clergy and the nobility. They made up a tiny 2% of the population. Just 2%. And the other 98%? Well, that was the third estate. Basically, everyone else.
So who were these groups really? The first estate was the church, super powerful. The second estate was the nobility, the lords and landowners. And the third estate was literally all the other people. We're talking everyone from the poorest peasant farmer to the rising class of city professionals and merchants, the bourgeoisie. These were people who might have had some money, but they had zero political power.
So with the country in a total crisis, you can probably guess what happens next. That 98%, they finally decided they'd had enough. It was time for the people to rise up and demand real change.
Now here's where the system was just so obviously rigged. The king, seeing all the problems, called a big meeting called the Estates General. But see, the way the voting worked, each estate got one vote. So the clergy and the nobility, those two tiny groups, could always team up and outvote the third estate, 2-1. The voice of 98% of the country was worthless.
So what did they do? They did something amazing. They just walked out. They went to a nearby tennis court and they took an oath declaring that they were the real government of France. They called themselves the National Assembly. This wasn't a protest anymore. This was a direct challenge to the king. The revolution was on.
But as soon as this new National Assembly formed, it started to crack. And in the process, it actually created a political divide that we are still using to this day. I'm talking about the birth of left versus right.
And believe it or not, it all came down to where people physically sat in the room. On the right side of the hall, you had the conservatives. They wanted to, conserve some of the old traditions and maybe share power with the king. But on the left side, you had the liberals and the more radical Jacobins. They wanted huge, drastic change. And the most extreme among them wanted to get rid of the king altogether.
And we have to talk about these Jacobins. They were this incredibly radical group on the far left. Led by guys like Maximilien Robespierre, their goal was absolute. They wanted to totally erase the monarchy and crush anyone who stood in the way of their perfect vision for a new French republic.
And that uncompromising vision, well, it leads us directly to the revolution's absolute darkest chapter, the Reign of Terror. This is where the dream of a perfect society turns into a total bloodbath.
This timeline just shows how incredibly fast everything went off the rails. In January of 1793, King Louis XVI is executed. And get this, the vote to kill him passed by a single vote. 1. By September, the Jacobins are in charge and the Reign of Terror officially kicks off. But in a wild twist, less than a year later, the terror consumes its own creator, and Robespierre himself gets sent to the guillotine.
The scale of the killing was just mind-boggling. The Committee of Public Safety, a group that was supposed to protect the revolution, officially executed 17,000 people, 17,000 in less than a year, all of them branded enemies of the revolution.
And as our source material puts it so well,
The revolution started eating itself. Once the obvious enemies like the monarchists were gone, the radicals just turned on each other. If you weren't seen as radical enough, you were suddenly an enemy too. It became this terrifying machine that just constantly needed new enemies to feed on.
So, after years of this chaos, this civil war, this terror, you can imagine the people of France were just exhausted. They were desperate for peace and stability. And that desperation created the perfect opening for a new, very powerful man to step onto the scene. I mean, look at this path. It's the whole tragic story in 5 steps. First, the people get rid of their king. Then, radicals take over and create total chaos with the terror. That chaos leads to a power vacuum, which a brilliant general named Napoleon Bonaparte steps into, promising to restore order. And once he has all that power, what does he do? He crowns himself emperor. France had gone full circle, trading one absolute ruler for another.
So what are we supposed to make of all this? What's the big lesson? For our last section, let's zoom out and look at how our source compares the French Revolution to the American one, which had happened just a little bit earlier.
Now, this is a really fascinating argument. The source suggests that the goals were fundamentally different. The French revolutionaries, especially the Jacobins, were trying to build a perfect utopia on Earth. They wanted to get rid of all evil, and to do that, you have to force everyone to conform or you eliminate them. The American founders, on the other hand, had a more modest goal. They wanted a more free and just society, one that actually planned for the fact that people are imperfect and allowed for different, competing ideas to exist.
And that brings us to the final, really heavy question that our source leaves us with. If you believe you have the blueprint for a perfect society, a utopia, what do you do with the people who disagree? What do you do with the people who don't fit into your perfect plan? The source suggests that the noble dream of creating heaven on earth, when forced upon imperfect people, almost always leads to a kind of hell. And that's something we're thinking about.